Good morning. My name is Jim McQuage. I've been a member of First Presbyterian Church for approximately 48 years. And I'd like to talk a little bit about the early history of the church. I wasn't around at the beginning of First Presbyterian Church, but done a little bit of research and have a few things I'd like to share. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the events that were going on in Sumter, parallel to the early years of First Pres, and I'm going to talk a little bit specifically about Reverend Donald McQueen. And if any of you have been to into the session room, there's a gallery of pictures of the preachers that have served this church, and his picture is first, but he was not the first minister. I think the reason for that is that the church was founded in 1823, almost 200 years ago, and cameras were not invented at that particular time. Maybe photography was in its infancy. But there were several preachers early on that we do not have pictures of. As I said, we're going to talk about Reverend McQueen. One reason he's important to this church, he is the longest serving minister. He served for 42 years, which is by far the longest tenure for any of our preachers. Dr. McLeod served for 25 years. All of you remember Dr. McLeod. But his tenure was only 25 years compared to 42 for Reverend McQueen. Anyway, this church was founded, organized in 1823. I think the date was May 29th. And then next year we're going to celebrate the 200th anniversary. It was a very small beginning. Harmony Presbytery was represented at that early meeting, and there were only 5 members that were part of the initial organization. One of the members was the wife of the first preacher that served this church. And it was interesting to me because he was a Northerner. He came here from Massachusetts back in 1823. His name was Reverend Isaac Barber, and his wife was one of the 5 first members. And he did not serve very long, though, because I'm not sure what his age was at that time. I suspect he was retired from a church in the north, and she passed away within that first year. So his tenure was very short-lived, and he went back north after serving as a preacher for that 1 year. And after that, the church had a series of ministers who also had short tenures prior to Reverend McQueen coming on the scene. During that early time, and he was not a minister at the time, but there was a teacher who was teaching in the Sumter schools. And his name was James Stornwell. He was a teacher, and he became a member of First Pres. And after being a member, he left the teaching profession and went back to seminary, and had a brilliant career, well recognized in the Presbytery. in South Carolina, and probably served in some other churches in the South as well. And Thornwell Children's Home was named for James Thornwell, who was a member of this church at one time, early on. Anyway, when the church was founded in 1823, Sumter was known as Sumterville. It was a small community. It was actually, we think of Sumter now as the largest city in this county. In 1823, it was not the largest city in this county. The largest city was the city of Manchester, which is located between Wedgefield and Pinewood. Manchester was actually the 10th largest city in South Carolina at that time. And I'm not sure what the population numbers would be, but it was ranked as number 10 in the state, much larger than Sumter. And if you ride down Highway 261 between Wedgefield and Pinewood, there's signage indicating the location of Manchester, but there are no buildings. The lost city of Manchester is no longer there. There are a few dirt roads that you can sort of figure out where the streets were located, but it's no longer there. No trace of being a town. Manchester had a serious fire in the I think it was in the 1850s, prior to the Civil War, that destroyed probably a third of the village. And fire started in one house and spread to right down the street, and about a third of the town was destroyed. But Manchester came into to its own as sort of a trade center. It was located near the Wateree River. Agriculture was big in this community at the time, particularly cotton. Eli Whitney had invented the cotton gin, and the agricultural land in Sumter County, Lee County, and probably toward Florence, the eastern part of the state, was ideal for growing cotton. And Manchester was a sort of a center for, it was close to the river, so farmers could put their cotton on a barge, float down the river to Manchester, and cotton could be processed and baled, and then on down the river as far as to the port at Charleston. So it was a thriving center. It was located in what's known as the King's Highway, which was the main route between Charleston, Camden, and on to Charlotte. In fact, there was a stagecoach route. You could take the stagecoach, board the stagecoach in Charleston, travel to Manchester, and it was like a staging area. You could spend the night in Manchester and then continue your journey the next day on to Charlotte or Camden or wherever you wanted to go in that area. Manchester had 0 churches. It was not well churched at all. There were probably some country churches that were near Manchester in that area that probably had a congregation, but there was no church congregation in Manchester. There were plenty of taverns, saloons, to to entertain the travelers as they spent the night in Manchester on the way to Charlotte and points there beyond. But Manchester had a right bawdy reputation, I think, back in that time. Anyway, enough about Manchester. Talk about Reverend McQueen just a little bit. His initial ministry was sort of a shared ministry with the Concord Presbyterian Church, which probably is the oldest Presbyterian church in Sumter County, I would think. I think it goes back to the 1700s. And, it was sort of the mother church for First Pres at that time. And Reverend McQueen was like a dual pastor. He served Concord and Sumter Church. From 1837 to 1850. This church did not have a building at that time. The services were shared services with the Baptist church. The Baptist church, I guess, when their services were over, maybe they have. I'm speculating that it was an afternoon service that our church would use their facilities. Of course, the size of our congregation was very small at that time. In 1850, First Pres built its first building, and the research that it was not on this site. It was. I'm not sure of the actual location. From what I read, it was at the edge of the community. So it was on the edge of town somewhere. I'm not sure whether it was north, south, east, or west. Small building, but that was the first church building that served this congregation. And it also marked the time that Reverend McQueen became the sole pastor of First Pres. He gave up the dual pastorship, shared pastorship with Concord at that time, became the sole pastor, and served on till his health failed him in 1879. And if you think about it, the years from 1850 to 79 were very turbulent. It was a very turbulent time in the history of this country. The Civil War was right in the middle. It began in 1860. It impacted Civil War as well as separating the states. It separated the churches. The southern churches had their own organization, separate from the northern churches. It's true in the Presbyterian Church, Baptist, Methodist, and probably some other denominations as well. It was not only were we divided as far as politically, our churches were divided as well. We won't get into all the causes and reasons and justification for the division, but it was a turbulent time. The war between the states particularly impacted Reverend McQueen and his family. He and his wife had 4 children, and Alex McQueen, I think, was the number 2 son, and he was about 20 years old. He was a prime candidate to serve in the Confederate Army, and he did. And he was recognized as a very capable member of the Confederate Army. Served at Gettysburg, several other major battles, and was injured at least twice, and came back to Sumter to recuperate, went back to serve, and toward the end of the war, he was recuperating in Sumter, and the date was April 9, 1865, and Lee surrendered to Grant at Appomattox Courthouse, and on that very day. But news traveled very slow at that point in time. The telegraph system had been invented, but the war had decimated a lot of the telegraph lines at that point. So the word did not get to Sumter that Lee had surrendered, which really, for all practical purposes, ended the war. But Sumter had not been impacted directly by the war up until that time. But on that very same day, there was a splinter group from Sherman under General Potter, whose task was to come to the Manchester area to intercept a Confederate supply train. I'm sure they had some underground information that there was a train being assembled in the Manchester area that had supplies to take to North Carolina to resupply General Johnston, who was the Confederate general, and it was sort of the last gasp of the Confederacy. And Potter left Georgetown and marched towards Sumter, and with the goal of traveling past Sumter to Manchester to destroy this train. The people of Sumter decided to put together a ragtag group of locals, young men, older men, found all the ammunition and firearms they could to greet General Potter, and there was a skirmish at Dingle's Mill, which is about 4 miles to our east, right off of Highway 521. There's a marker there today. Anyway, in the middle of this skirmish, Alexander McQueen was based on his prior experience serving in the Confederate Army, he was qualified to operate a cannon piece of artillery, and he was killed. He was killed by returning cannon fire at the Battle of Dingle's Mill. There was one report that I read that sort of indicated that maybe Reverend McQueen was part of the local militia. But I only saw one reference to that, so I tend to believe that he probably was not. I think there were probably some townspeople that went out to Dingle's Mill and viewed the skirmish from afar, and my feeling is that maybe Reverend McQueen was part of that group. and realized that his son had been killed in battle on that day. So not only did he have to deal with some of the politics and impact on his church, but it was a personal loss as well for him. But after the war was over, he continued to serve this church until 1879 when he became ill, and he resigned at that point in time and only lived a few months after he resigned before he passed away. So that ended his ministry here. As a side note, in addition to Alex McQueen, there was a younger son who was also, he was named for his father. Now, he was not the firstborn, but I guess they were running out of names, so they named him Donald McQueen Jr. And he went on he was educated, and then went on to seminary and became a Presbyterian minister. He served several churches in Georgia and maybe some other parts of the South, mainly in Georgia. I think he met his wife at a church in Milledgeville, Georgia. And so I know he served that church, and that's where he was buried after his death. But in 1923, he was invited to come to this church, and on the 100th anniversary, and he preached a sermon probably in this building, and so to help us celebrate the 100th anniversary, and hopefully we'll be able to contact some of the descendants of the McQueen family and invite them back to the 2023 celebration.